Welcome to the Crypto Show, guys. It is Monday, the 27th of February, 2017. We are coming to you from Anarchapulco in the heart of southern Mexico, in Acapulco, Mexico, for the third annual Anarchapulco conference. We are joined by some illustrious guests, and actually our biggest audience ever, and our biggest audience, whether live or over the airwaves. So there must be like 5 people out there. So pretty huge. We're very excited by this. But we're going to have a sort of separate but follow-up discussion about the future of Bitcoin, and specifically with respect to the block size issue that's been going on for quite some time, and the two opposing, if you will, sides, Segregated Witness and Bitcoin Unlimited. And for this debate, we have, of course, Roger Ver. On
our champion, Roger.
Woo-woo! Oh wait, I can't do that. It's gonna make me sound biased. I'm gonna woot for you too, though. We also have John Dilley. Woo-woo! Thank you. Representing Segregated Witness, and sitting in, kind of watching, is Trace Mayer, and of course another illustrious Bitcoiner, early adopter and investor and proselytizer, like Roger Ver, for Bitcoin. And in fact, Trace Mayer is responsible for the questions.
He's the matchmaker today.
And he's the matchmaker.
Cupid.
Oh, Cupid, draw back your bow. Thank you, Trace, for that, and some really good, hard-hitting questions. Now, these are questions he wrote down, so if I don't quite get them right, of course, people are going to step in and correct me, whether that's Trace or these two guys. So, I guess let's get right to it. Let's see. Now, I guess I'll address this to you to start off with, Roger. The idea of economic consensus, I think, as opposed to, let's say, mining consensus or technical consensus within the community. How do those relate to each other? How do those complement or compete with each other? Am I asking this question correctly?
Yeah, I mean, like Roger was talking about the economic code, like what is Bitcoin? So maybe you can address that.
There you go.
So, Bitcoin's been around for about 8 years now. I've been involved for a little over 6 of those years, and the reason I was attracted to Bitcoin was because of the underlying economic code of Bitcoin, and that was irreversible, instant, peer-to-peer payments worldwide at very, very low cost, and that the ability of Bitcoin to do that today is being undermined. Bitcoin transactions cost more money than ever before to do. The transaction times are longer than ever before. It takes sometimes hours or even days, or sometimes not at all, for transactions to be confirmed in blocks. They're easier to be double spent than ever before. This is undermining the economic code of Bitcoin that made Bitcoin the success that it is today. And a group of people that are involved in Bitcoin think that it's just fine that Bitcoin fees are higher than ever before. They think it's just fine that Bitcoin confirmation times are longer than ever before. They think it's just fine that it's easy to double spend Bitcoin transactions. And this is a giant, giant, giant problem for the underlying economic code of Bitcoin that led Bitcoin to go from being basically nobody using it to now millions of people around the world. And if that underlying economic code of Bitcoin is changed, that's every bit as dangerous to the future of Bitcoin as changing the software code of Bitcoin. If you break the software code of Bitcoin, Bitcoin is broken. If you change the economic code of Bitcoin, Bitcoin will be broken and people will start to use something else. And as the earliest investor in the entire world in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and as a large holder of Bitcoins, and as the CEO of Bitcoin.com, I am terrified about the economic code of Bitcoin being changed.
Okay, excellent. Well, I certainly don't doubt that there are many people who are complacent with what's going on, as you say, but surely there are people on the Segregated Witness side, or just in general, who aren't happy with where we're at either. So I don't know, John, how would you respond to what he just said?
I mean, first I'm going to speak to the fact that there's a bit of a mischaracterization of Bitcoin in the way Roger thinks about it. You cannot have an instant transaction in Bitcoin. Fundamentally, in order for a transaction to have settled or confirmed, requires work. So, and the characterization of Bitcoin as being easier to double spend or easier to reverse, or transactions not confirming rapidly, is a misconception. You cannot assume that a transaction that is zero confirmation or waiting in the mempool is necessarily going to be confirmed ever. It is a viable opportunity. Like, miners could choose to make empty blocks for the rest of all time, and that is a valid use of mining power. Now, obviously, they're not economically incentivized to do that. However, the characterization that a Bitcoin transaction that is just in the mempool is confirmed or a valid Bitcoin transaction is not true. It is not valid until it is confirmed. So I would speak to that first. Second off, I would speak to the fact that
Can I address that point, or how do we want to go for the
I mean,
back and forth?
that's fine. You can address that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe we'll do our best to each stick to one specific topic at a time.
That might be a good idea, so it doesn't get muddled. So address that, and he'll have his second point. Go ahead,
So
Roger.
what Johnny said there, louder. And just because I'm talking louder doesn't mean that my argument is more correct.
I'm picking you up from that mic, that's why.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll talk louder towards that mic as well. So anyhow, I think what Johnny just said is actually a fantastic example of the different way of viewing Bitcoin of a lot of people that are involved in Bitcoin in the Bitcoin core team. They view unconfirmed transactions as basically not transactions at all. And it's not either they're confirmed or they're not, they're safe or they're not. It's a sliding scale where with unconfirmed transactions, you can have it where it's super easy to double spend at any time until it's included in a block, or you can have it where you know pretty darn for sure that it's very, 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 very likely to be included in the next block. And for someone who uses Bitcoin for actual payments, you want to make sure that you know with as much likelihood as you possibly can that transaction is going to be included in the next block. So it's not like a binary option of either it's confirmed or it's not. There's a sliding scale in regards to the amount of safety or the likelihood of the transaction being included in the next block. And as Bitcoin users wanting to make Bitcoin as useful as we possibly can to people around the world, we want to make it so that it's as trustworthy as we possibly can to know that an unconfirmed transaction is going to be included in the next block. And we understand it's not included. But
I know, but do you agree that it's an unsafe practice to assume that an unconfirmed transaction is an actual Bitcoin transaction?
Absolutely not. Businesses do it every single day. I've accepted Bitcoin transactions today for more than $20,000 each with zero confirmations.
Would you accept a zero confirmation $500,000 transaction?
The software might. So it depends on the circumstances.
But you're talking about the characteristics of now the incentives of the system don't hold up under those conditions. Like if you're accepting unconfirmed $500,000 transaction, there are incentives for miners and strategic action to reverse that payment, and that person who paid you with an unconfirmed transaction to pay themselves.
So by making Bitcoin transactions easily reversible, you're making the incentives even larger.
The properties of the system have always allowed for double spending, always.
But the properties of the system much more recently have been altered to make it much easier to double spend transactions.
How so?
In the early days of Bitcoin, the general rule was called first seen, first safe, which meant the first transaction that was viewed on the network was the one that was due to be included in the next block.
That assumes miners are not being strategic.
And as someone who's running a mining pool and heavily involved in mining, and I did a bunch of mining back in 2012 myself in my own warehouse, miners are mining a Bitcoin. Miners want Bitcoin to be worth as much as they possibly can because that's the product that they're mining. So they're incentivized to make Bitcoin as trustworthy and as reliable and safe as they possibly can because that increases the value of the product that they're mining.
And
while you might be able to say that about certain miners, you cannot say that about all people who can become miners. That is strictly not how the system works.
Guys, so it's not lost in the shuffle for our audience. Do clarify why this is such an important thing with respect to this debate, just in case it's not clear.
Well, the fundamental characteristic of Bitcoin is that work, primarily the conversion of electricity into security, is what provides Bitcoin a substantial amount of its characteristic value. And you do not get that, you don't get components of that value by just putting something in the mempool.
So can I ask you to clarify, you're saying that the reason Bitcoin is valuable is because people did work and converted electricity into Bitcoin?
One of the characteristics of its value, yes.
Can you say what you think the other reasons Bitcoin is valuable?
I think Bitcoin is a valuable system from many perspectives because of one, its robust and consistent focus on security as a tenet, and two, its robust and consistent censorship-resistant practice. Other characteristics are obviously its ability to make border-to-border, cross-border payments.
Why does Bitcoin have a value, I guess is what I'm asking. Why do you think Bitcoin is valuable?
I mean, all of those things. It's the fact that it's a deflationary storage of value. It's the fact that it can pay people border-to-border. It can do machine-to-machine payments. There's a whole number of characteristics, including the fact that proof of work happens to drive the chain forward, regardless of whether or not who controls that proof of work.
So if I can say why I think Bitcoin's valuable, if
Go ahead.
that's okay. So, and I think you kind of tap danced around it, but there's a really, really easy and simple way to say why Bitcoin is valuable. Bitcoin is valuable because it's useful and because it's scarce. And anything that's useful and is scarce has value. And so our job, if we want Bitcoin to be valuable and have the price of Bitcoin go up, we need to make Bitcoin as useful as we possibly can. And by undermining the ability of Bitcoin transactions to be accepted as safe enough without having been confirmed in the block, that's undermining the usefulness of Bitcoin, and that's undermining the value of Bitcoin. And as anybody who uses Bitcoin for payments knows, you want to be able to accept Bitcoin without having it been confirmed in a block as safe enough.
You're entitled to do that, but you are trusting the person you are accepting a zero confirmation payment from explicitly.
So why have a blockchain? Why? Do you want to elaborate on that question?
Yeah, I mean, if we're dealing with zero confirmation if we're dealing with zero confirmation transactions and asserting that it's safe to receive them, like, why have a blockchain at all, Roger?
A zero confirmation transaction is not as safe as one that's included in the blockchain. So of course we want a blockchain so we have this irreversible ledger for the end of time to keep track of who owns what on the Bitcoin blockchain. But that doesn't mean that we should make it so that confirmations or Bitcoin transactions that haven't been confirmed can be altered and changed at any time whatsoever. And I hear so many people on the other side of the scaling debate think that it's perfectly okay to allow Bitcoin transactions to be double spent at any point right until they're included in a block. And that's insanity for anybody that's actually using Bitcoin for payments in commerce.
It's a fundamental characteristic of the system.
But it's not a binary option. It's a sliding scale. So either unconfirmed transactions can be pretty darn safe, or they can be instantly
what does
pretty
darn safe mean?
Pretty darn safe means safe enough to use in most instances.
You can reorg the network back several blocks and undo something. Like let alone something that's just in the mempool.
Are you disagreeing with me that it's not a sliding scale? You think it's binary, yes or no?
I think you have some statistical assurances by including a high fee paying transaction such that miners are incentivized economically to include it in the next block, but that does not give you any stable assurances with regards to its state in the ledger. It's not in the ledger yet.
Okay, so you're saying that we shouldn't make any attempt whatsoever to make unconfirmed Bitcoin transactions as safe as we possibly can?
I think that that's a characteristic of the businesses or the individuals who have different trust characteristics than those who are solely utilizing proof of work as their trust characteristic.
So I can tell you every single person that's using Bitcoin for payments wants zero confirmation transactions to be as safe as possible.
So you like Lightning then?
I love Lightning, sure.
Okay.
Well, let me just chime in. For what I know, it does seem like there's a sliding scale in the sense of there's a different risk assessment based on individual circumstances. So, like, yes, if it's a $5 transaction, the risk of a reversal is probably slim. A $500,000 transaction is, as even John stated, there's some risk of it because there's a huge incentive behind it. I mean, so do we know statistics behind any actual reversals or double spends?
Someone would know better than me, but reorganizations are a fundamental property of a proof of work blockchain because miners are not well aligned necessarily in their incentives. Some miners may be willing to selfishly mine, other miners may be willing to selectively exclude blocks of a different miner. As a result, the state or the assurance you have about the characterization of your payment requires that you have an amount of depth behind the work of the system. The mempool is not an assurance about the mempool is an assurance about the potentiation of your transaction to get into Bitcoin. It is not an assurance about your transaction ever being in Bitcoin. Period. That is a necessary characteristic of this system.
So I don't think I really disagreed with anything you said there, but I think where we do disagree is I'm saying that we should work to actively make unconfirmed transactions as likely and safe as we possibly can to be confirmed in the next block so that merchants can accept them basically instantly. And I hear that you're saying we shouldn't even bother to try to do that because it's not part of the system or something.
I would state that what you're looking for is something that has much more of the topicological characteristics of Lightning, whereby users have relationships that are known, bounded relationships that have capital in them or pre-attested in them between them and their merchants or them and their payees. And as a result, they can do instantaneous confirmations between those two people as a result of having a Lightning relationship.
So the short version of what you're saying is that for Bitcoin on-chain transactions, we shouldn't even try to make them as safe as we can?
You can from a business or application logic layer perspective, but from a protocol layer perspective, the characteristics of the system don't allow you to make it safer.
That's simply not true. They're
So-
less safe now than they ever were before.
You've always been able to double spend, and you've always been able to
here's the
manage
thing.
the system.
why? I can explain why. So previously, up until maybe 6 months ago, pretty much every single transaction was included in the very next block. So you had about a 10-minute window in which the transactions could be diverted or double spent or had something happen. Now that the blocks are all full all the time, instead of having a 10-minute window in which a transaction could be double spent, you now have hours or even days long double windows. So it went from maybe being 10 minutes worth of time where it could be double spent to now hours and hours. So that's a real world example that's indisputable, which transactions are now less safe than they used to be.
I could actually argue that as a result of the Poisson distribution, which is the means by which blocks are found, which is on 10 minutes on average, you actually don't have an assurance. Sometimes you'll go an hour without a block being found.
But
And
the
it's
average
because it's an
confirmation
average, right?
time for Bitcoin transactions today is longer than it was previously, which means the amount of time that they could potentially be double spent today is longer than it was previously, which means the ability to double spend transactions today is easier than it was previously because you have a longer period of time to do it for each transaction.
So we could go on
you
forever on
disagree?
this.
And that's not necessarily true. As a function of the fact that reorganizations can occur at any time, you don't have assurance.
We're talking about-
We could go on
Giant
forever on
averages
this
here.
topic. I feel like we should move on. I mean, this needs further exploration, obviously, but I think we're kind of at an impasse. So why don't we have a closing statement on the topic from each of you, relatively brief, and we'll move on to the next question. John, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I would state that I understand Roger's business and person to person or person to peer or person to another
Entity to
client.
entity, yeah.
Entity to entity. It's an app, but he's talking about an application or a business logic question, and he's trying to. It's a layer violation. That's how we would describe it in the technical parlance. He's talking about applying characteristics that need to be done on a business to business or a person to on a person to their client relationship, where he wants a level of trust between those two parties about the confirmation of a coin that he cannot get as a result of the characteristics of the system, unless you happen to have something like a payment channel relationship with that party already. So it sounds like the exact use case you want for your transactions or for people that are utilizing Bitcoin could easily come from something like the Lightning Network. And that's actually great. I actually think that we actually have.
I think we agree
some
on most
agreement
of that. Yeah,
that's
We're both
exciting.
looking forward to that.
Yeah, I think the fact that the Lightning Network addresses those concerns completely is something that is very powerful. I think that's very powerful.
Okay, any additional words from you?
Absolutely. So, I'd like to point out, as a user of Bitcoin for 6 years, objectively speaking, Bitcoin, the network itself, is much, much, much more dangerous to use and much less reliable than it was before. And that's a direct result, and I explained exactly why the reason it is. Bitcoin transactions are easier to be double spent than ever before. They take longer to be confirmed than ever before. It's a big, big, big problem for people that are using Bitcoin in commerce. And people using Bitcoin in commerce is the reason Bitcoin has value today. It's the reason there's all this venture capital funds investing in the Bitcoin space. There's the reason that there's all these Bitcoin conferences around the world is because people are using Bitcoin for payments. And if Bitcoin becomes less useful for payments and more expensive and less safe to use, fewer people will be using Bitcoin.
I actually would state that that's a little bit. That conversation requires a little bit more nuance.
Okay.
The velocity of money is not necessarily the only characteristic that drives value of money. In Bitcoin's case, it's because it's a deflationary store of value in the context of the fact that it's not something that is easily politically manipulatable or easily undermined. So I think that there is, to a point, a relationship between the velocity of the money, as you state, the commerce that's underlying it, and Bitcoin's price and Bitcoin's value. But ultimately, I would state that a larger component of it is the fact that as a storage of value, it is unlike any other asset that's ever existed.
All right. Well, interesting stuff. Let's move on.
If I can make one final
Really quick, Roger.
So the reason Bitcoin has value is because of the people who save it, not because of the people who spend it. And the reason people save it is because they think they'll be able to spend it in the future. But it's the savers of Bitcoin that give it value, not the spenders of Bitcoin.
All right. Well, let's move on. So segregated witness is a soft fork change to the network, whereas Bitcoin Unlimited would be a hard fork. You'd have a split in Bitcoin. I guess the question is, what is the kind of moral hazard to be had with a hard fork?
I actually think we should talk about. Let's talk about the characteristics of the two proposed changes or upgrades. Or
as a background, that's a good idea.
And then I think trace is more the moral hazard mark on the paper more has to do with the moral hazard behind forking itself, not necessarily the
specific fork.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
the
Gotcha.
specific fork. And I can talk to both systems. I know both upgrades, but if you want. So segregated witness is.
Although if I can have 2 seconds.
That's fine.
I'd like to point out that a hard fork is just a euphemism for a protocol upgrade. So every time you hear someone saying hard fork, just think of it as being a protocol upgrade, and then it doesn't sound nearly as scary.
It's a backwards incompatible protocol upgrade. That is a important distinction, whereas a soft fork is backwards compatible.
Very true.
So that we can get to that in a second. I'll talk about the two upgrades first. So the segregated witness is an amazing innovation by a number of core developers, which basically moves I'll talk first. A Bitcoin transaction or a Bitcoin block includes transactions themselves, which is TXIDs, the UTXO, and the scripts and signatures associated with those components. Segregated witness is the idea that we can move the signature information to what's the specific is the Merkle root of the Coinbase, but we can move it into a separate kind of caboose for a normal block, and as a result, we can get a substantial amount of more space in the transaction for more transactions. I think right now, if segregated witness shipped, it would be 130% on average capacity increase to Bitcoin.
Assuming the wallets adopted it. In the format of their transactions.
Yes, and we have not almost universal, but close. We have a large majority of wallets at this point have adopted it. Blockchain.info has signaled that they're ready.
It's every wallet's job to be ready for wherever the network heads.
Yes,
so
exactly.
They'll be ready for that, and they would be ready for Bitcoin Unlimited too.
We can get to that in a second. So segregated witness enables a number of other interesting bug fixes for Bitcoin as well as a result of changing some components for segregated witness transactions. It solves something called transaction malleability or external transaction malleability, which is basically that a miner or an external party can malleate that TXID for a transaction. As a result, it makes applications or business logic that attempt to reference a transaction much more. The infrastructure required is much higher. It's a higher order, so it's much more complicated. It also allows something that's very powerful for hardware wallets called signature covers value. And signature cover value basically means that when a wallet signs for a transaction, it also includes information about the amount it's signing for. So it simplifies, for example, the hardware process. So it makes like both Trezor, Ledger, KeepKey, and a number of the other hardware wallet companies are all very excited about segregated witness because it enables them to do much more powerful things with their hardware wallets, like notarization and things like that, without a lot of infrastructure required in the hardware wallet itself. It changes a characteristic of classic Bitcoin transactions, which is that they have quadratic scaling of signature hash operations, and it changes that into a linear scaling of signature hash operations. And this is part of the reason why when Gavin originally proposed an 8 megabyte block or even a 2 megabyte block with classic Bitcoin transactions, there were concerns about the characteristics of those blocks.
Because is this linear scaling easier on the network?
Yes. So there's something called an attack block, and an attack block is essentially you can compose a block with certain kinds of transactions, scripts, and signature sets such that it takes a substantial amount of time to validate. So I think with a 1 megabyte Bitcoin block, you can make an attack block that takes like 39 seconds to validate. It's a long time from a miner's perspective. At a 2 megabyte block, I think Phantom Circuit or Sergio Lerner demonstrated that you could do one that took as much as just 14 minutes to validate.
Oh wow!
So you can see that there's potential under those kinds of conditions for miners to have strategic action that disenfranchises smaller miners and as a result compresses the centralization, compresses the decentralization network.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a number of other nice componentries to segregated witness as well. Some of them slip my mind, but it's essentially a number of bug fixes and technical debt cleanup for the network.
So it's more than just block size, addressing the block size.
The capacity increase happens to be thanks to Luke Jr. The capacity increase happened to be something we didn't know we could do as a soft fork, and we happened to figure out that we could actually do it as a soft fork, and that was a nice bonus to segregated witness as an upgrade.
Okay, and do you want to explain?
And then I'll explain Bitcoin Unlimited. So Bitcoin Unlimited is
actually. Can I add one comment?
Please. Go ahead.
I'd actually like to compliment you. I think you did a fantastic job of explaining segregated witness, and I think I agree with just about everything you said there in regards to that. So fantastic job.
Thank you.
Describing that.
Okay.
Excellent.
Bitcoin Unlimited is the argument that miners are already in control of the system, so why don't we just give them control of the block size as well? Or other, you can argue that you can also ultimately give them control of selective components across the protocol, and as a result of their short, medium, and long-term incentivization, they'll do what's best for the network because it's what's best for themselves.
Now, real quick on that, does that imply that there's any sort of potential adversarial relationship between miners and Bitcoin Core?
There already is a substantial. So there's a substantial problem with this argument, but let me explain. Let me explain how it works first. Is essentially they change the fixed construct in Bitcoin Core or the other Bcoin and Bitcoin D and all these LibBitcoin and all the other compatible protocols. They change a fixed constant into a two-part constant, which is a excessive block size and an acceptance depth. And the idea being that you see a block that is, let's say you're comfortable accepting 2 megabyte blocks, and anything above 2 megabytes, your node's just going to kill itself. It just can't handle the validation or whatever the chain tip is. It just won't be able to handle it. So you put I'm going to accept blocks up to 2 megabyte in size, and your node will basically attempt to relay and will accept as valid blocks that include up to that 2 megabyte in size. And then you have something called acceptance depth, which is that in the event that you see a block larger than that size for a period of time, you will revert that's larger than the 2 megabytes in this case, you will revert your excessive block size to whatever the size of that block was that you saw. So a really easy example, you've set it to 2 megabytes, you see a bunch of 2 megabyte blocks for a while, then you see a 2.1 megabyte block, you mark it as invalid, but that chain ends up continuing for a period of time. If that period of time it continues for is longer than your quote-unquote acceptance depth, you will revert your excessive block size to the maximum size of that new chain. So it's a radical change to the way in which consensus works, because consensus now becomes, Peter Arcar calls it emergent consensus, but essentially you have to have this bounded statistical problem where everyone's trying to figure out what everyone's relative excessive block size to acceptance depth functions are and try to drive the chain forward with this kind of influx, kind of almost quantum position. And as a result, it makes it a lot more difficult for us to come to consensus about the characteristics of the system. B, it encourages certain types and kinds of selfish mining. And C, it ultimately will tend towards a further centralization of the network because it empowers large miners at the expense of smaller miners.
Could it increase the likelihood for double spending or any other kind of?
I would state that any characteristic change to Bitcoin that empowers large miners at the cost of small miners, or empowers certain nodes at the cost of other nodes, implicitly hurts the decentralization of Bitcoin.
So at some point, I'd like the chance to.
Sorry, I was just
No problem.
trying to
just wanted to make sure I did get a chance.
No, go ahead,
please.
And thank you for the excellent description of segregated witness, and thank you for a pretty good description of Bitcoin Unlimited. Although I could tell we have a little bit different opinions on there. But what I'd like to point out, like all the things that you talked about, segregated witness solving and the improvements that it makes, those are all good things to have done, and none of them are urgent. That what's really urgent for Bitcoin right now today is to get the transactions can cost more than $10 each sometimes. $10, $20, $30, $50 each for a single Bitcoin transaction is not uncommon today. Bitcoin transactions waiting for hours and hours to be confirmed in the next block is common today. That was never, ever, ever the case until very, very recently when the blocks became full. So segregated witness solves some problems that will be nice to be solved but aren't urgent at all. Bitcoin Unlimited solves the nightmare of a user experience that people that are having Bitcoin or using Bitcoin for commerce today are having. It makes it so your Bitcoin transactions are going to be confirmed in a timely manner and for a reasonable price, and the risk of double spending is going to go down. So Bitcoin Unlimited solves the problems that the Bitcoin network is experiencing today. Segregated witness solves some problems, yeah, but those problems aren't urgent. The problems that we're having today are with Bitcoin transactions taking forever to get confirmed and costing a fortune.
If it solves them at the cost of decentralization and censorship resistance, it is not a cost the system should be willing to bear.
And I completely disagree that it would cost them at those costs and or solve them at those costs. And it's worth pointing out, like lots and lots of people seem to be afraid that, if it takes, if blocks are bigger, it's going to take a more expensive computer to run a full node. That's true. But today, maybe we have, 10, 20, maybe even 30 million people around the world interested in using Bitcoin. If we allow Bitcoin to be used by billions of people around the world, we're going to have a lot more people using Bitcoin, which means there's a much bigger base of people to run full nodes from, and there's a whole lot more social resistance against governments trying to ban Bitcoin or enforce AML or KYC policies upon Bitcoin. If 1 billion plus people are using Bitcoin around the world and government says, oh, we want you to register every transaction with us, and people know how easy it is to do a Bitcoin transaction without their government's permission, people are going to do it anyhow. Or if government tries to demonize Bitcoin by saying it's only used for drug dealers and child pornographers, but people are using Bitcoin to buy their Starbucks coffee, people are going to laugh at the government when they say that. Whereas if Bitcoin's limited to a small number of people, when government tries to demonize Bitcoin in that way, people might believe it. And that's a really, really big fear for Bitcoin. And if I can add a little bit more there, I've been involved for 6 years with Bitcoin. My initial strategy when I got involved was I knew governments weren't going to like Bitcoin. And we're here at Anarchapulco, right? A big room full of people that probably don't like governments too much. My strategy to protect Bitcoin from governments was to grow it as fast as we possibly can, as quickly as we can, because in addition to having protection from government by having this distributed architecture, you also can have protection from government by having mass adoption. The more people that use Bitcoin, the safer it is from government intervention.
All right, John, respond, and then I want to transition to the second part of what this topic was, which was the moral hazard inherent in fork.
Okay, so there's a couple of points here, and I think Roger articulates the concerns he has about the need for more users as a result of it becoming inherently, as a result of more users, more censorship resistant. I'm going to speak to two of those points first. So the first one is that there's an inherent problem in the argument that more people means more nodes. Primarily, we can see this as objectively false over the last 6 years, say 8 years of Bitcoin. We went from 60,000 nodes to I think 5,800 today. So we've actually had a dramatic decline in the number of nodes because the actual cost to run a node is increasing. There are bandwidth and throughput constraints a lot of places of the world. It takes, in some cases, 400, 500, 1,000 gigabytes a month to run an actual node. Just throughput turnover as a result of you seeding blocks, as a result of you seeding the mempool. And those costs are not going to go down. If Bitcoin has demand, which it does, and that's a great thing, it's fantastic. The demand for Bitcoin will continue to go up. There's another component to this, to Roger's argument that has a bit of a misconception as well. There's unbounded demand for free storage, unbounded demand for free transactions. In a system that has the characteristics of Bitcoin Unlimited, the incentives are increasingly for large miners to attempt to push that block size as high as it can go as a result of trying to meet that unbounded demand. And now you as Joe user, or you as Joe business, who's maybe marginally profitable, are going to be facing an increasingly higher cost to run a full node. And the only assurances you have in Bitcoin that you are actually utilizing Bitcoin is if you are validating your transactions in real time. Otherwise, you are trusting someone else, and if you're trusting someone else, you're not getting, or you may be getting some of the characteristics of Bitcoin as the asset class, but you're not getting Bitcoin, the characteristics of Bitcoin as the cryptographically verifying signature system. So the properties.
Are you arguing that people that use a client on their phone aren't using Bitcoin?
Like clients are explicitly trusting application layer and business logic layers to utilize to be on their behalf.
So are you saying that that's not using Bitcoin? Or?
You are utilizing Bitcoin, the asset, and you may be utilizing some aspects of it, but you're explicitly trusting a company to A, not double spend you, or B, not Sybil attack you off the network, and C, you're explicitly trusting them to not be spying on your transactions, to be validating it on the one true chain. There's a whole bunch of characteristics that by using a light client you're not gaining.
Do you use a light client on your own phone?
I have a Trezor and a core node. That's
so you don't have a Bitcoin wallet on your phone?
I think I have one for the first time recently. I'm more of a holder than I am a spender of Bitcoin.
Can I ask how often do you actually spend or use Bitcoin?
I used it in a poker game recently, I think. So I mean, I'm probably a 10 time a year, or maybe a 20 time a year, but
once a month ballpark.
I mean, personally, but from my perspective, Bitcoin is the most sound money in the entire world. Why would you ever spend it? You should be holding as much Bitcoin as possible, and it's by definition the perfect deflationary asset. It has a fixed supply and a permanent increasing demand and a decrease in its inflation characteristics.
I think you're wrong when you think it has a permanent increasing demand. If something else comes along that's more useful than Bitcoin, people are going to use that.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by something else that comes along that's more useful?
Sure. There's 1,001 other competing cryptocurrencies.
How many of them have like really good developers?
I'm sure lots of them have good developers. And here's the thing.
Can you name one? Can you name one?
Sure. I think Monero has an interesting development team.
Fluffy Pony's a pretty good guy, and I think they might have 6 or 7 developers.
Okay.
How many does Bitcoin Core have?
You can tell me, you're part of it.
I think it's about 115 or 120 contributors.
Okay. And the reason why is because Bitcoin has the biggest network effect. But I hear lots and lots of things coming from developers like yourself who admittedly use Bitcoin about once a month. I use Bitcoin more times than I can count every single day. I've already sent more than $100,000 in Bitcoin transactions today.
I know.
As part of my business, Bitcoin is becoming less and less useful every single day because of the network congestion. And if people like me, they're using Bitcoin for commerce and saving Bitcoins, I'm a saver too. I have a large pile of Bitcoins. If I get fed up with the high fees and easiness of double spending on Bitcoin network and start using something else, a bunch of other merchants are, Bitcoin will lose its network effect. People are going to use something else, and these 150 Bitcoin Core developers are going to start working on something else because it's no fun to work on something that nobody's using. That's a real possibility with Bitcoin. That's how serious the problem is with Bitcoin.
I know, and I would state, and I think that this addresses your concerns almost entirely, is that what you're asking for as someone who has a lot of high throughput, small value transactions for your large,
and I do some big ones too.
For your large value transactions, you may be interested in the trust topology of a multi-confirmation Bitcoin transaction. You're like that's a legitimate, valid use case of the Bitcoin network. But for your small value transactions, like we just bought a sandwich at a vegan shop. That's exactly what the Lightning Network is for.
Looking forward to it. I think we're both looking forward to it.
I know, but like the point being is that if segregated witness gets over at the bar and it gets activated, you address the throughput constraints problems that you're talking about.
Lightning Network is
so let's have some final thoughts on this topic, and then we'll move on to the next one.
And I have about 10 minutes left before I have to run.
Oh, okay.
I have a card.
All the more reason for us to do that. Well, actually, let's just go on to the next one then, since that was a pretty long discussion. So the Bitcoin Core roadmap. Tell us about that, John. Roger, respond. Essentially, what comes after SegWit? Because it seems that it's only a temporary stopgap solution with respect to the block size, not with respect to other things.
Well, it's a cleanup of a lot of technical debt in the way the system operates by enabling this new transaction type. But my memory came back to me. Another component of it is that it enables script extensions to be much easier in Bitcoin. So I hear Roger's concerns. I think fungibility in Bitcoin is increasingly a concern.
Completely agreed.
I think throughput is definitely something we need to be expanding upon, and I think that ultimately privacy is also something as well, but less so than I think components like reasonable smart contracting evolution and stuff like that. So part of the Bitcoin Core roadmap, after we have segregated witness, it enables things that are very powerful. Like, for example, the Schnorr signatures, masked, aggregated signatures, Mimblewimble, Tumblebit, and ultimately the Lightning Network. I think all of these things in combination, each of them individually give us things like further throughput, further capacity increase on chain, changes to the dynamics of, for example, coin joins or services that help you gain more privacy as a Bitcoin user, regardless of your use case of the Bitcoin network. These are all things that we have in mind as possible evolutions of the Bitcoin network. And in order to roll them out, require that we come together behind a specific solution, and we don't see things like this coming out from the Bitcoin Unlimited team. We do, because fundamentally, unless I'm mistaken, Bitcoin Unlimited doesn't support segregated witness right now. There's no consensus amongst your group of 4 or 6 developers that there needs to be
more than that.
I think the list is 8. I think 8.
I think there's even more than that. But okay.
Okay. Well. There's no consensus that this type of evolution, which is making Bitcoin smarter, making Bitcoin more fungible, making Bitcoin more scriptable, more smarter, essentially smarter and leaner Bitcoin. It's not. We don't see that coming out of the hard fork at all costs now, because Bitcoin needs more throughput team. We need to. The characteristics that make Bitcoin valuable are that it retains its characteristics as a robust, secure at all costs, censorship-resistant machine. And hurting the decentralization of the network by further empowering miners, by handing consensus over to them, is not in the best interest of Bitcoiners.
So I know part of what you're saying is that like the block size is not everything, that there's other aspects of it that are going to make Bitcoin robust or not. But nonetheless, specifically, since that's kind of part of the debate, with the effective block size of segregated witness, something in like 3 megabytes or something, from what I've heard, I could be wrong. Where do you go from there? Now, that's where the Lightning Network comes in, and explain that and how that's going to.
I want to give Roger a chance to speak, but
yeah.
So Schnorr gives us another 20 to 30% capacity on top of it. Aggregated signatures incentivize behaviors like aggregated coin joins, which is a very, very powerful characteristic. I welcome everyone to have a conversation with their local core developer about what we can do with aggregated signatures. Mast enables a bunch of really cool things, like where you can have federations external to the Bitcoin network, have smart contracting rules on Bitcoin that like instantiate automatic withdrawal from the federation in the event the federation stops advancing. There's a whole bunch of very interesting things that come from the kinds of upgrades that we're talking about along Core's pathway. Tumblebit, Mimblewimble, both amazing fungibility properties that come from those two systems. Mimblewimble, as described by Andrew Polster, is kind of a bit like Hawking's radiation. It's like we're a black hole. Whatever. The only thing it emits is the energy of whatever it's destroyed or crushed, and that's essentially what happens in a Mimblewimble transaction. Then ultimately the Lightning Network addresses throughput concerns, because you can have an near infinite. The speed of light obviously mitigates some things, and obviously there's trust topologies in Lightning Network as well. But the Lightning Network enables, amongst your payment channel relationships, an infinite number of transactions up to the total amount of capital in the payment channels. And that is a very compelling scaling layering. You're talking about 1,000 to 10,000x on top of Bitcoin, not this kind of linear scale that you're going to get from a block size increase.
Exponential kind of scale.
It is a massive improvement, because it takes the transaction types that Roger is a valid Bitcoin user is entitled to want to make, and it moves the kind of trust required from those transactions from one that need to wait in a mempool and pay a high fee, or meet in the mempool and pay a fee to be included next, to one where he has a pre-attested amount of Bitcoin that he and that person agree have a different trust topology. And that is very compelling.
My turn.
Yes,
Roger, go ahead.
So I'd like to start out I'm excited about just about everything you just talked about, Johnny. Those are all great things that I'm looking forward to. Bitcoin Unlimited doesn't preclude any of those things. Right? The part that I'm concerned about is that right now, today, the Bitcoin network is less useful than ever before from the pure network protocol level, right? Transactions are more expensive, slower to confirm, easier to double spend. And I see you guys working on all sorts of things that are going to take years before they're ready, and you're not addressing the problems that the Bitcoin network is experiencing right now, today, whereas the Bitcoin Unlimited team is. The Bitcoin Unlimited team is working on addressing the problems that people that actually use Bitcoin for payments more than once a month are experiencing. They're having a nightmare. If you're running a business and using Bitcoin right now today, or if you have a payment processor or anything, you're being flooded with the support tickets from your customers saying, why didn't my transaction confirm? Why did this happen? What's wrong with this? It's a nightmare. We have to hire more people at Bitcoin.com to all these people that are new to Bitcoin and don't know much about it. They assume that Bitcoin.com is the official website, so they come to us and say, why didn't my transaction for, Bob's golddealer.com go through? And it's like, deal with him. So anyhow, this is a big problem, and the Bitcoin Unlimited team is trying to address the problems that Bitcoin is having today, whereas I see the core team not caring about the fundamental aspects that make Bitcoin useful today and wanting to build out all these Star Trek things that are going to be awesome. Like, I'm looking forward to these things. They're going to be here, but it's going to take years. Focus on the problems that Bitcoin has today, and once those are solved, then we can move to the next step.
So I would state that segregated witness right now would enable, on average, 130% capacity increase.
Which is not even nearly enough.
I think Ben of BitGo actually came out today and said that in the event that it was turned on, they were utilizing something like 16% of all block space, and as a result, fees would go down by about 50% if we aggregated segregated witness today. I mean, you can talk to Davenport yourself. It's not, that's not. But I mean, and a lot of the characteristics for the transaction types you're talking about for users, a lot of that had to do with the fact that, I mean, at least for 6 months ago and more recently as well, wallets were not properly utilizing fee estimations. So, for example, people were getting transactions.
What's an appropriate fee for a Bitcoin transaction?
I think today I think it was 30 cents, 25 cents.
What should it be is what I'm asking you.
Ultimately, it has to do with the space that's available. Like I said.
So how should the space that's available be set?
I think it's the price per byte. I'm not at the specifics of it.
Maybe you're not understanding my question. Now, how should the amount of space available for transactions to be put in and be set.
Basically, supply and demand.
Yeah,
kind of?
it's supply and demand. People, if you're
So why is the
willing
supply being artificially limited?
I don't think it is being artificially
It's
limited.
hard
What do you
capped
mean?
at 1 megabyte, and we knew for years and years and years that the Bitcoin network is going to be congested, and the current Bitcoin core team actively blocked every attempt to solve that problem
So it's
for years in advance. And now that it's become a real problem for real people that are using Bitcoin, you guys are saying, "Oh, we've now made this thing segregated witness," which was months and months late from when it was initially promised. And you say, "Well, why don't you use this problem, this solution that we've created to solve the problem that we've created?" That's nuts, right?
Engineering's hard, and first off,
Engineering
it's
is
not,
hard.
First off, it's not our problem. Satoshi set the 1 megabyte limit in, and thankfully, it actually happened to be a pretty good limit because
We have 2 minutes left, so maybe
I know,
some
the-
final
the-
closing statements. Or
Do we want to try to
the-
squeeze in an extra topic, or probably not?
Nah, I don't know what
Okay,
time.
yeah.
maybe
the-
closing statement for myself and Johnny. And
Part,
we'll go.
part,
Okay.
of, part of the problem with the fact that there's unbounded demand for free transactions and the fact that also scripts and signatures take computational work to verify is ultimately there's a topology to the network that we choose to, or not we choose, that the characteristics that the system happens to have are those that are robust, secure, and focus on censorship resistance. Okay, and there's obviously the moral hazard that comes from attempting a non-backwards compatible fork, because people who came before you and people who came after you and people who are joining Bitcoin today are opting into a system that has certain rule set. Attempting to change that rule set in a non-backwards compatible way forces those who came before you and those who are here now to opt into that rule set. And there's a lot of moral hazard in that kind of equation, which is why we choose to, why Bitcoin Core as a loosely affiliated group of individuals usually agree that soft forks are a methodology that are much more in the best interest of the Bitcoin network, because it doesn't force people to use the new rule set. Now,
So I have about a minute before I have to run.
All right,
Is
so
it-
go ahead, Roger, and I'll let him respond.
I thought that was his closing statement.
Okay, there you go.
So I guess I'd like to point out, so we just heard from Johnny, who's someone who uses Bitcoin about once a month by his own estimation there for a poker game here or there, works for a company that holds most of their assets in dollars, not in Bitcoin, who raised $75 million from traditional banks. That's my timer telling me I have to go. And whereas there's myself and the on-chain scaling people, we use Bitcoin every single day for commerce. We have over 30 employees at Bitcoin.com now, I think. Every single one of them is paid entirely in Bitcoin. We don't even have a bank account. We do more transactions than I can count every day. Myself personally does more transactions than I can count every day. And we heard from Johnny, he doesn't care how high the Bitcoin transaction fees get. It's just fine with him. I'm sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth.
You're mischaracterizing.
So but we did hear from him very clearly that he doesn't seem to care how easy it is to double spin Bitcoin transactions before they've been included in a block. For anybody that's using Bitcoin as a payment network and as a payment system, Bitcoin's in big trouble.
I would state that the use case you're describing for Bitcoin is one that is perfectly met by the Lightning Network.
That will be ready in several years, I hope.
Well, actually,
I hope it'll be ready tomorrow, but I think several years
Actually,
is the
if
reality.
you ask Lightning Labs or the Chain Code Labs guys, or I think there's 7 teams working on Lightning now.
So it's one thing to be ready in theory. It's another to actually be ready for people to use to pay for their coffee downstairs.
Well,
and for it to be ready to pay
we-
for their coffee downstairs is
Yeah.
years away. And I think we should probably agree on that.
If we activated segregated witness today, we'd have a malleability fix. And if we have a malleability fix, we could have the Lightning Network very soon versus 8 years away.
It takes time to build the software wallets for people to use it, especially
Yes.
on their mobile phones.
No,
So
I agree. So,
I have to run, and I apologize, but
All right, Roger, Barry, thank you so much
Yeah, thank
for
you
the
guys.
debate. More interesting stuff. Pleasure.
look forward to round 2. Thank you, Johnny. I do appreciate it. So thank you
We
guys.
have 100 live viewers. If anyone can stay for questions, I know Roger.
Yeah,
Is Jake out here? But Jake can fill in. Hey, Jake, you get round 2.
Are we still going?
Yeah, I have to run, but you're
Not this guy. No, just kidding.
Have a seat. You get my seat.
Yeah, leave that camera running. Is that still running? Yeah, it's still running.
Here's the earphone.
I got 100 live viewers.
John, do you mind staying for a little bit longer
no,
to
I
field
think
questions
can.
and stuff?
No,
I
I
appreciate
can-
that.
I can
Excellent.
Did you hear everything up until now, Jake?
Yeah.
Okay. See you guys.
All right, thanks, Roger. All right, well, of course, thanks to John Dilley as well. Roger had to go. Second in a series of debates about segregated witness and Bitcoin Unlimited and the future of Bitcoin.